The electricity between them was so thick, David could practically taste it. And when Gary finally whispered those three words he'd been desperate to hear, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Gary's hand was warm against David's cheek, thumb brushing across his skin with a tenderness that made David's breath catch in his throat. This was the moment everything changed. The moment when months of careful friendship and hidden longing finally exploded into something real and undeniable. But to understand how they arrived at this life-altering confession, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, when David thought he had his sexuality all figured out, and Gary was just his impossibly attractive straight roommate who would never see him as anything more than a friend. David had always prided himself on being self-aware. At 24, he thought he knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. He'd dated women throughout college, had a few serious relationships, and while none of them had quite felt like the earth-moving love he'd read about in books, he'd assumed that was just romantic fiction setting unrealistic expectations. Real love, he'd told himself, was comfortable and stable, not the passionate whirlwind of novels and movies. Then Gary Collins moved in as his roommate, and suddenly David's carefully constructed understanding of himself began to crumble. Gary was everything David wasn't. Where David was quiet and introspective, preferring books to parties and thoughtful conversation to small talk, Gary was effortlessly charismatic. He could walk into a room and immediately become the center of attention without even trying. His laugh was infectious, his smile could light up the darkest corners, and he had this way of making everyone around him feel like they were the most interesting person in the world. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. David had found Gary through a roommate matching service, drawn to his profile because he seemed responsible and clean. Two qualities that were essential after David's previous roommate had left the apartment looking like a tornado had swept through it. What the profile hadn't mentioned was how devastatingly handsome Gary was, or how his presence would turn David's quiet, orderly life completely upside down. The first time they met in person, David had opened the door to find Gary standing there with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a smile that made David momentarily forget how to speak. Gary was tall, probably 6'2" to David's 5'9", with dark hair that always looked perfectly tousled and eyes the color of warm honey. He had the kind of effortless attractiveness that made David acutely aware of his own appearance, suddenly wishing he had changed out of his old college t-shirt and actually combed his hair that morning. "You must be David," Gary had said, extending his hand with that killer smile. "Thanks for letting me crash here. I promise I'm house-trained and everything." David had laughed, probably a little too loudly, and invited him in. As Gary had looked around the apartment, nodding approvingly at David's neat bookshelves and organized kitchen, David had found himself cataloging every detail. The way Gary's jeans fit perfectly across his hips, the way his t-shirt stretched across broad shoulders, the way he moved with an unconscious confidence that David envied. "This place is great," Gary had said, turning back to David with genuine enthusiasm. "And you've got an incredible book collection. I'm kind of a reader myself, though I lean more toward thrillers and mysteries than—" He'd squinted at David's shelves, the complete works of Jane Austen. "Don't knock Austen until you've tried her," David had replied, surprising himself with how easily the banter came. Pride and Prejudice has more psychological complexity than most modern thrillers. Gary had raised an eyebrow, looking intrigued rather than dismissive. "Is that a challenge?" "Maybe," David had said, and something had sparked between them in that moment, something that David had immediately tried to dismiss as simple friendliness. Living with Gary turned out to be both easier and more difficult than David had anticipated. Easier because Gary was exactly as responsible and clean as his profile had suggested. He did his dishes, kept his bathroom spotless, and never hogged the television. He was also surprisingly thoughtful, always asking if David needed anything when he went to the store and remembering little details like how David preferred his coffee. The difficult part was how Gary's presence seemed to fill every corner of the apartment, even when he wasn't there. David would catch whiffs of his cologne lingering in the hallway. He'd find himself listening for the sound of Gary's key in the lock when he was out late. Worst of all, David found himself looking forward to their interactions with an intensity that felt dangerous. Gary had a girlfriend when he moved in, a perfectly nice woman named Jennifer, who worked in marketing and had the kind of polished beauty that belonged in magazines. She was everything David wasn't, feminine and confident, with long blonde hair and a wardrobe that probably cost more than David made in a month. She was also, David had to admit, completely wrong for Gary. It wasn't that Jennifer was a bad person. She was perfectly pleasant. The few times David had met her, always polite and friendly. But David could see the way Gary's smile never quite reached his eyes when she was around, how he seemed to be performing rather than simply being himself. Jennifer talked constantly about her job, her workout routine, her social media followers, but she never seemed particularly interested in Gary's thoughts or opinions. She laughed at his jokes, but David got the impression she wasn't really listening to them. David told himself his observations were just those of a concerned friend. Gary deserved someone who appreciated his intelligence, his dry sense of humor, his surprising depth. The fact that David found himself cataloging all of Gary's best qualities was just because he cared about his roommate's happiness. It had nothing to do with the way his stomach flipped when Gary smiled at him, or how he'd started timing his coffee breaks to coincide with Gary's morning routine. The first crack in David's carefully constructed denial came about 6 weeks after Gary moved in. They'd fallen into a comfortable evening routine of watching Netflix together, usually some crime drama they could both agree on. Gary would stretch out on one end of the couch, and David would curl up on the other end with a book, half watching the show and half reading. That particular evening, Gary had seemed more restless than usual. He'd started the night at his usual spot, but had gradually migrated closer to the center of the couch until his thigh was almost touching David's leg. David had tried to focus on his book, a new mystery novel he'd been looking forward to, but he was hyper-aware of Gary's proximity. Every time Gary shifted position, every time his leg brushed against David's, it sent little shocks of electricity through David's system. Quote 9, Gary had muttered during a particularly implausible plot twist. Somehow, in a quote, David had replied, glancing up from his book with a smile. Quote 12, Gary had said with mock seriousness. Quote, they'd fallen into easy conversation about the show, about real criminal cases they'd read about the psychology of both criminals and investigators. It was the kind of conversation David loved, meandering and thoughtful, touching on everything from sociology to philosophy. Gary had insights that surprised David, perspectives he hadn't considered. As they talked, Gary had shifted again, this time turning to face David more directly. His knee was definitely touching David's leg now, a warm pressure that David couldn't ignore. Gary seemed completely unconscious of the contact, gesturing animatedly as he made a point about confirmation bias in criminal investigations. You know, Gary had said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, I really enjoy these conversations. Jennifer's great, but she's not really into this kind of deep discussion stuff. David had felt something twist in his chest at the mention of Jennifer, a sharp pang that he'd immediately tried to suppress. He'd asked, aiming for casual interest. Gary had shrugged, looking suddenly uncomfortable. Work stuff, mostly. Her friends. Social media drama. Nothing wrong with that, he'd added quickly. Quote 18. There had been something wistful in Gary's voice, a longing that David had recognized because he felt it himself. The longing for someone who really understood you, who wanted to explore ideas and emotions with the same intensity you did. David had felt a dangerous flutter of hope, quickly squashed by the reminder that Gary was straight, taken, and completely off limits. Maybe you just need to find the right topics, David had suggested, hating himself for playing the relationship counselor when what he really wanted was to close the distance between them and find out if Gary's lips were as soft as they looked. Quote 20, Gary had agreed, but he hadn't sounded convinced. The conversation had stayed with David for days afterward, replaying in his mind during quiet moments at work and keeping him awake at night. He'd found himself analyzing every word, every inflection, looking for hidden meanings that probably weren't there. Gary was just being friendly, confiding in his roommate the way people did. The fact that David felt like they'd shared something intimate was just his imagination running wild. But then similar moments kept happening. Gary would linger in the kitchen while David made breakfast, leaning against the counter with his coffee and talking about everything and nothing. He'd knock on David's bedroom door late at night to share some random thought or funny story. He started asking David's opinion on things, from what movie to watch to whether he should cut his hair. Most tellingly, he started complaining about Jennifer more frequently, though always in subtle ways that made David think Gary himself didn't fully realize what he was doing. Quote 21. Gary had mentioned one evening settling onto the couch with a book David had recommended. Quote 22. David had looked up from his laptop where he'd been grading papers for the high school English classes he taught. Reading makes you antisocial? Apparently, she thinks I should be more focused on networking, building my personal brand. Gary had made air quotes around the last two words, his distaste evident. What do you think? David had asked carefully. Gary had been quiet for a long moment, staring down at the book in his hands. It was the Jane Austen novel David had challenged him to read, and David had been secretly thrilled to see Gary actually following through on it. I think, Gary had said slowly, that I've never felt more like Basoyi than I do when I'm reading something that makes me think, or having conversations that actually matter. I think maybe I've been so focused on being who I thought I should be that I forgot who I actually am. The words had hit David like a physical blow, so close to his own feelings that he'd had to look away. He'd spent so much time trying to be the person he thought he should be, the straight man with the normal desires and conventional goals, that he'd never stopped to consider whether that person was actually him. Quote 28. David had managed to say, his voice carefully neutral. Gary had looked up then, catching David's eyes with an intensity that made David's breath catch. Quote 20. Tell, he'd said softly, it really does. The moment had stretched between them, charged with possibility and unspoken questions. David had felt like they were standing at the edge of something profound, a conversation that could change everything. But then Gary's phone had buzzed with a text from Jennifer, and the spell had been broken. Gary had glanced at his phone and sighed. 31. Quote 30. David had asked, though he'd already known the answer. Yeah, Gary had said, but he'd sounded tired. Quote 34. David had wanted to say something then, wanted to tell Gary that he didn't have to do things that made him unhappy, that he deserved someone who loved the parts of himself that Jennifer seemed to want to change. But David's motivations weren't pure, and he'd known it. He'd wanted Gary to break up with Jennifer, not because it would make Gary happy, but because it would give David a chance, however slim, to be more than just a roommate. So David had said nothing, and Gary had gone back to his book, and they'd sat in comfortable silence, while David's heart had ached with all the words he couldn't say. The turning point had come in early November, on a night when the first real cold snap of the season had hit the city. David had been grading papers at the kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside him, when he'd heard Gary's key in the lock. But instead of Gary's usual cheerful greeting, David had heard only silence. He had looked up to find Gary standing in the doorway, still in his coat, looking like he'd been through an emotional hurricane. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were red-rimmed, and his usual confident posture had crumpled into something small and defeated. Gary? David had set down his pen immediately, concern overriding everything else. What happened? Jennifer and I broke up, Gary had said, his voice flat and emotionless. David's first instinct had been relief, a surge of selfish happiness that he'd immediately felt guilty about. Gary was clearly hurting, and David's own feelings were irrelevant in the face of his friend's pain. I'm sorry, David had said, standing up and moving toward Gary. Are you okay? Do you want to talk about it? Gary had shrugged out of his coat, hanging it on the hook by the door with mechanical precision. She said I've been distant lately, that I've changed since I moved in here. Changed how? David had asked, though he'd had a sinking feeling he already knew. Quote 42. Gary had moved to the kitchen counter, gripping the edge with white knuckles. Quote 40. David had felt like he'd been slapped. I'm sorry, he'd said quietly. Gary had cut him off, turning to face David with fierce intensity. The words had hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that David hadn't dared to interpret. Gary had looked at him with such raw honesty that David had felt exposed, like Gary could see straight through to all the feelings he'd been trying so hard to hide. Quote 48. Gary had continued, his voice softer now. Quote 49. David's heart had started beating so hard he'd been sure Gary could hear it. Quote 50. Quote 15. Gary had said, taking a step closer. Quote 52. David had frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any response would shatter whatever spell had made Gary brave enough to say these words. Quote 53. Gary had continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Quote 50. David had asked, his own voice trembling. Gary had stepped closer again, close enough that David could smell his cologne, could see the flecks of gold in his honey-colored eyes. Dom. David had stared at him, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. Gary had rushed on. Quote 60s. David had asked, incredulous. Quote 61. Gary's eyes had widened, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. Really? Really, David had confirmed, taking a step closer himself. I've been watching you with Jennifer, giving you relationship advice when all I wanted was to tell you that you deserve someone who saw how incredible you are. Someone who loved your mind as much as everything else about you. Someone like you? Gary had asked, his voice barely audible. Someone like me, David had whispered. They had stood there for a moment, the weight of their confessions settling between them. David had felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into something that would change his life forever. Can I? Gary had started, then stopped, swallowing hard. Can I kiss you? David had nodded, not trusting his voice, and then Gary's hands had been cupping his face, thumbs brushing across his cheekbones with infinite tenderness. Gary's eyes had fluttered closed as he'd leaned down, and David had done the same, their breath mingling in the space between them. The first touch of Gary's lips against his had been electric, soft and hesitant and perfect. David had felt like every nerve ending in his body had suddenly come alive, like he'd been living in black and white, and suddenly the world had burst into color. Gary had kissed him like he was something precious, something to be savored, and David had melted into it completely. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Gary had rested his forehead against David's, his eyes still closed. Gary had whispered. David had agreed, his voice shaky. They had stood there like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, both of them trembling slightly with the magnitude of what had just happened. It's 72, Gary had admitted quietly. Quote 70, David had said. Quote Gary. Gary had opened his eyes then, looking at David with such tenderness that it had made David's chest ache. What do we do now? I don't know, David had said honestly. I've never done this before either, but maybe we don't have to figure it all out tonight. Maybe we can just see what happens. Gary had smiled then, the first real smile David had seen from him all evening. I'd like that. Me too, David had said, and then Gary had kissed him again, deeper this time, with more certainty and less hesitation. The next few weeks had been a revelation. David had thought he'd understood what it meant to be happy, but living openly with his feelings for Gary had shown him he'd barely scratched the surface. Everything felt more vivid, more intense. Colors seemed brighter, food tasted better, even the mundane tasks of daily life felt infused with joy because he was sharing them with Gary. They had taken things slowly, both of them navigating uncharted territory. Gary had never been with a man before, and David had never been in love like this before. Every touch, every kiss, every quiet moment together felt like a small miracle. Gary had moved his things into David's room after the first week, claiming his own bed felt too big and lonely. David had pretended to grumble about Gary taking up more than his fair share of the mattress, but secretly he'd loved the way Gary curled around him in sleep, the way he'd wake up to find Gary's arm draped across his waist. They had spent hours talking about everything and nothing, exploring this new dynamic between them. Gary had been endearingly uncertain at first, constantly asking if what he was doing was right, if David liked it, if he was being too clingy or not affectionate enough. David had assured him repeatedly that he was perfect, that everything he did felt natural and right. I keep waiting for it to feel weird, Gary had confessed one evening as they'd lain tangled together on the couch, David's head on Gary's chest. Quote 80, and David had suggested, tracing patterns on Gary's chest through his t-shirt. Maybe you've always been this person, and you just needed the right situation to discover it. Maybe, Gary had agreed, his fingers combing through David's hair. Quote down. David had laughed at that, lifting his head to look at Gary. Quote, Gary had said with mock seriousness. And David had said, leaning up to kiss him. Quote 90. Gary had corrected against his lips, but it hadn't all been easy. Gary had struggled with the implications of his sexuality, wondering what it meant for his future, how his family would react, whether he was being fair to David by figuring things out as he went along. He'd had moments of panic, times when the weight of changing his entire understanding of himself had felt overwhelming. David had been patient through all of it, offering reassurance without pressure, space without distance. He'd reminded Gary that sexuality was fluid, that labels mattered less than feelings, that there was no timeline for self-discovery. What if I'm just confused? Gary had asked one night after a particularly vivid dream about his ex-girlfriend had left him questioning everything. What if I'm just rebounding from Jennifer in the weirdest way possible? Then we'll figure it out together, David had said simply. But Gary, you've been questioning your relationship with Jennifer for months. You've been drawn to me for months. This isn't some sudden impulse. It's been building for a long time. You really believe that? Gary had asked. I know it, David had said with conviction. I've been watching you discover who you really are, piece by piece. This isn't you being confused. This is you being honest. Gary had kissed him then, desperate and grateful, and David had felt the last of Gary's doubts melting away. The real test had come when Gary's best friend from college, William Foster, had come to visit for a long weekend. William was the kind of aggressively heterosexual guy who made crude jokes about women and seemed to view any deviation from traditional masculinity as a personal threat. David had been dreading the visit, worried that William's presence would make Gary retreat back into the closet. But Gary had surprised him. When William had made a disparaging comment about the quote 98 David had made for breakfast, Gary had defended David's brewing skills. When William had suggested they hit up a strip club, Gary had declined and suggested they stay in and watch a movie instead. Most importantly, when William had asked about Jennifer, Gary had been honest. We broke up, Gary had said simply. Dude, finally, William had said, cracking open a beer even though it was barely noon. She was way too high maintenance for you. So what's your type now? Blondes? Brunettes? Please tell me you're not going to start dating redheads, because I have some stories. Gary had glanced at David, who had been pretending to read in the corner, but had obviously been listening to every word. Actually, Gary had said, his voice steady, I'm seeing someone really special. Nice, William had said, not really paying attention. She hot? He, Gary had corrected quietly, is beautiful. The silence that had followed had been deafening. William had stared at Gary like he'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language, his beer bottle frozen halfway to his mouth. William had repeated, quote 109. Gary had said, looking directly at his friend with quiet defiance. Quote 110. David had felt his heart swell with pride and love. Gary could have deflected, could have made up a story about some fictional girlfriend, but instead he'd chosen honesty. He'd chosen David. William had looked around the apartment like he was seeing it for the first time, his gaze landing on David with new understanding. Gary had said firmly, quote 113. William had struggled with it. David could see that. His worldview was being challenged in a way that clearly made him uncomfortable. But to his credit, he'd tried. So you're gay now? William had asked, his voice carefully neutral. I'm Gary, Gary had replied. Same as I've always been. I just know myself better now. The weekend had been awkward at times, but it had also been a turning point. Gary had introduced David as his boyfriend without hesitation, had held his hand while they'd watched movies, had been affectionate and natural in a way that had shown David just how far they'd come. After William had left, Gary had been quiet for a while, processing what had happened. How do you feel? David had asked as they'd cleaned up the aftermath of the weekend. Quote 118, Gary had said after a moment. Quote 1, quote 1, quote 1, Gary had said with a shrug. Quote 1 on, David had kissed him then, overwhelmed with love and admiration for Gary's courage. I'm proud of you, David had whispered against Gary's lips. Gary had corrected. As winter had given way to spring, they'd settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. They'd started talking about the future, making plans that extended beyond the next month or even the next year. Gary had started the process of coming out to his family, starting with his sister, who had been surprisingly supportive. David had introduced Gary to his parents during a video call, and they'd been charmed by Gary's warmth and obvious devotion to their son. They'd faced challenges, of course. There had been moments of doubt, times when the outside world had made their relationship feel fragile and new. But they'd weathered each storm together, their bond growing stronger with each obstacle they'd overcome. The night that had brought them full circle, back to that moment of electric connection and whispered confessions, had started like any other. They'd made dinner together, David chopping vegetables while Gary had handled the actual cooking, since David's culinary skills extended only to boiling water and making toast. They'd eaten while watching the news, Gary's hand resting casually on David's thigh, both of them commenting on the day's events. It had been during the quiet moments after dinner, as they'd cleaned up together with the easy efficiency of long practice, that Gary had grown thoughtful. He'd said as he dried the last plate, David had replied, hanging up the dish towel. Quote, one day, David had considered the question seriously. Quote, 129, he'd admitted, but not in a wistful way, more like, grateful that we did meet. Grateful that you answered my roommate ad instead of someone else's. I almost didn't, Gary had said, leaning against the counter. Your ad was so specific about wanting someone quiet and studious. I thought you'd probably think I was too loud, too social. What changed your mind? David had asked, moving closer. The part where you mentioned your book collection, Gary had said with a smile. I figured anyone who owned that many books had to be interesting, even if they were quiet about it. Best decision you ever made? David had asked teasingly. Best decision I ever made, Gary had confirmed, pulling David into his arms. They'd kissed then, soft and sweet, the kind of kiss that spoke of comfort and familiarity rather than desperate passion. But as they'd held each other in their quiet kitchen, David had felt the same sense of wonder that had overwhelmed him that first night when Gary had confessed his feelings. I love you, Gary had whispered against David's ear, the words still carrying the power to make David's heart race even after months of hearing them. I love you too, David had whispered back, and he'd felt Gary's arms tighten around him. They'd moved to the couch after that, settling into their usual positions with David curled against Gary's side. Gary had been reading the latest book David had recommended, a literary novel about family secrets and second chances, while David had graded papers with Gary's fingers combing absently through his hair. Quote 140. Gary had said suddenly, setting it aside to give David his full attention. Quote 141. David had looked up from his papers, curious. Quote 142. Quote 42. Gary had paused, his fingers stilling in David's hair. That's what you did for me, David. You didn't just make me realize I could be attracted to men. You made me realize I'd been pretending to be someone I wasn't for years. David had set his papers aside completely, turning to face Gary fully. You weren't pretending to be someone else. You were just discovering who you really were. Same thing in a way, Gary had said thoughtfully. I was so focused on being what I thought I should be that I never stopped to consider what I actually wanted. I dated Jennifer because she was the kind of woman I was supposed to want. I went to networking events because that was what successful people did. I avoided deep conversations because they weren't cool or fun. And now, David had prompted, now I know that what I want is this, Gary had said, gesturing between them. Conversations that matter. Someone who challenges me intellectually. Someone who sees me, really sees me, and loves what they find. Someone like me? David had asked, echoing their conversation from that first night. Someone exactly like you, Gary had confirmed, cupping David's face in his hands. Quote 153. The intensity in Gary's voice had taken David's breath away. Quote when Gary had continued, his thumbs brushing across David's cheekbones. But it's true. Before you, I was sleepwalking through my life. I was successful on paper, but I was empty inside. You woke me up. David had felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in Gary's words. Quote, he'd whispered, I was so convinced I knew who I was, but I was just as lost as you were. I was settling for relationships that felt safe instead of looking for something real. And now we have something real, Gary had said, his voice soft with wonder. The realest thing I've ever felt, David had agreed. They'd kissed then, and it had been like that first kiss all over again, electric and transformative and perfect. David had felt like he was falling in love with Gary all over again, seeing him with fresh eyes, appreciating not just how far they'd come, but how much further they could go. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Gary had whispered against David's lips, the words coming out in a rush like he couldn't contain them any longer. David's heart had stopped, then started beating double time. Gary had said quickly. David had started, hardly daring to hope. Atbain, Gary had said, his voice shaking with nerves and excitement. Quote 7. David had stared at him, speechless with joy and shock. In all his fantasies about their future, he'd imagined them moving in together officially, maybe adopting a pet, eventually talking about marriage in abstract terms. He'd never imagined Gary would propose so soon, so spontaneously, so perfectly. David had whispered, then louder. Gary's face had lit up with a smile so brilliant it could have powered the entire city. He'd kissed David again, deeper this time, pouring all of his love and excitement and relief into the contact. Quote 170. Gary had asked when they'd broken apart, both of them breathing hard. Really, David had confirmed, laughing through the tears that had started flowing without his permission. Gary Collins, I would love nothing more than to spend the rest of my life with you. I love you so much, Gary had said, holding David like he never wanted to let him go. I love you too, David had replied, and he'd meant it with every fiber of his being. They'd spent the rest of the evening talking about their future, making plans and sharing dreams. Gary had confessed he'd been thinking about proposing for weeks, ever since the night they'd had dinner with David's parents over video chat, and his mother had made a comment about how happy David looked. Ode 170, Gary had explained, quote 26. David had agreed completely. What was the point of waiting when they were both certain? They'd already been through the hard part, the self-discovery and the coming out in the adjustment period. They'd already proven they could weather storms together. The proposal felt less like a beginning and more like an acknowledgement of what had already been true for months. Quote 177, David had asked. Quote was saying on quote in Gary had suggested with a grin, only half joking. Quote what? David had laughed. Quote 181 on quote 182 beast Gary had suggested. Quote 183, quote 184 on. David had agreed. They'd talked about what kind of wedding they wanted, simple and intimate with just their closest friends and family. They talked about honeymoon destinations and whether they wanted to stay in their current apartment or look for something bigger. They talked about careers and children and growing old together. As the night had worn on, they'd migrated to the bedroom, continuing their conversation while getting ready for bed. It had felt surreal and wonderful, brushing their teeth side by side while discussing wedding venues, changing into pajamas, while debating the merits of destination versus local ceremonies. When they'd finally settled into bed, David curled against Gary's side with his head on Gary's chest. The conversation had turned more philosophical. Do you think we would have found each other eventually? David had asked. If you hadn't answered my roommate ad, if we'd never lived together, do you think we still would have ended up together somehow? Gary had been quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on David's back. He'd said finally, I'd like to think that some connections are inevitable, that the universe has a way of bringing the right people together. Even if you'd never questioned your sexuality, David had pressed, even if you'd married Jennifer or someone like her, I think I would have questioned it eventually, Gary had said thoughtfully. Maybe not with you specifically, but I think the dissatisfaction would have grown until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I think I was already starting to question things before I met you. I just didn't have the vocabulary or the courage to examine those feelings. And now you do, David had observed. Now I do, Gary had agreed, because you showed me it was safe to question, safe to explore, safe to be honest about what I really wanted. We showed each other, David had corrected. You gave me permission to want something real instead of settling for something safe. They'd fallen asleep like that, wrapped around each other, talking quietly about their future until their words had grown soft and slurred with exhaustion. David had drifted off with Gary's voice in his ear and Gary's ring finger against his back. already imagining the day when there would be a wedding band there. He'd woken up the next morning to find Gary already awake, watching him with an expression of such tender love that it had taken David's breath away. What a 9-8. Gary had whispered, testing out the word. Quote Y199. David had whispered back, loving the way it sounded. They'd made love then, slow and sweet and full of promises, celebrating their engagement in the most intimate way possible. Afterward, as they'd lain tangled together in the morning light, David had felt like the luckiest person in the world. Gary had asked, his voice soft with vulnerability. Quote 201, David had replied honestly. Quote 12, Gary had said. Quote Tawi, quote Tuaran, David had asked. Quote Tuan, Gary had said with conviction. Quote Asham, David had considered this, thinking about all the relationships he'd had before Gary, all the ways he'd settled for less than what he really wanted. Gary was right. They'd found each other at exactly the right moment, when they were both ready to be honest about who they really were. The months that followed had been a whirlwind of wedding planning and continued self-discovery. Gary had come out to the rest of his family with mixed but generally positive results. His parents had struggled initially, but had come around when they'd seen how happy Gary was. His grandmother had surprised everyone by being completely supportive, telling Gary that she'd suspected he might be different for years and was just glad he'd found someone who loved him. David's family had embraced Gary completely, welcoming him into their tight-knit group with open arms. Gary had fit in seamlessly, charming David's mother with his cooking skills and bonding with David's father over their shared love of mystery novels. The wedding planning had been surprisingly stress-free. They'd both known exactly what they wanted, a simple ceremony in the garden behind David's parents' house, with dinner and dancing at a local restaurant afterward. They'd written their own vows, choosing to keep them private until the actual ceremony. Gary had insisted on wearing matching suits rather than traditional tuxedos, wanting their wedding to reflect their personalities rather than convention. David had loved the idea, and they'd spent a wonderful afternoon shopping for the perfect outfits, Gary making David laugh until his sides hurt with his commentary on various fashion choices. Quote 200 on, Gary had suggested, holding up a suit that looked like it belonged in a 1970s prom photo. Quote 209, quote Tana, David had replied laughing. Quote 211, Gary had said with mock indignation. But to Tom, quote 2/3, David had teased. Quote one, Gary had agreed, hanging the suit back up. Quote down, they'd chosen simple gold bands, nothing flashy or elaborate, just clean lines and classic design. Gary had insisted on having them engraved, choosing "My Heart, My Home" for David's ring, and a quote 217 for his own. The bachelor parties had been low-key affairs. David's had consisted of dinner with a few close friends, followed by a night of board games and terrible movies. Gary's had been similar, though his friends had insisted on at least one bar where they'd spent the evening playing pool and sharing embarrassing stories about Gary's college years. Quote 218, Gary's friend Mark Sanchez had said as they'd walked home from the bar. Quote 220, quote 220, Gary had asked, genuinely curious. Quote 200, Mark had said, clearly struggling to articulate his thoughts. Quote 220, quote 220, Gary had prompted. Quote 220, Mark had said with a smile. Quote Tom, quote Gary had confirmed. Quote Tana, quote Tron, Mark had said thoughtfully. Quote Luchon, quote Taran, Gary had agreed. Quote Luton. The week before the wedding had been filled with final preparations and nervous excitement. Gary had been surprisingly calm, while David had found himself obsessing over tiny details that probably didn't matter. What if it rains? David had asked for the 15th time as they'd lain in bed the night before the rehearsal dinner. Quote Gary had said patiently. Quote Tartan, quote David had continued. Quote Tartan, Gary had said, pressing a kiss to David's temple. Or I'll trip too, and we'll both go down in a heap, and everyone will laugh, and it'll be a great story to tell our grandchildren. What if I forget my vows? David had asked. Then you'll speak from the heart, Gary had said, which is what you always do anyway. Gary's calm confidence had been exactly what David had needed. By the morning of the wedding, David had felt centered and peaceful, ready to marry the love of his life. The ceremony had been everything they had dreamed of and more. The weather had been perfect, warm and sunny, with a gentle breeze that had rustled the leaves of the oak tree they'd stood under. Their families and friends had gathered in a small circle around them, faces glowing with love and support. Gary had looked breathtaking in his navy suit, his hair perfectly styled and his eyes bright with unshed tears. When David had walked toward him, Gary's face had lit up with a smile so radiant that David had felt his own tears start to flow. The vows had been perfect, heartfelt, impersonal, and full of promises for their future together. Gary had spoken about how David had saved him from a life of pretending, how loving David had taught him what it meant to be truly authentic. David had talked about how Gary had shown him the difference between settling and choosing, how their love had taught him that the best relationships were built on seeing and accepting each other completely. When the officiant had pronounced them married, Gary had kissed David with such joy and passion that the crowd had erupted in cheers and applause. David had felt like his heart might burst with happiness, like he was living in a dream too good to be true. The reception had been exactly what they'd wanted, intimate and relaxed, with good food and dancing and speeches that had made everyone laugh and cry in equal measure. Gary's sister had told embarrassing stories about his teenage years. David's best friend had shared memories of David's dating disasters before Gary had come along. David's mother had welcomed Gary to the family with such warmth that Gary had cried openly. But the moment that had meant the most to David had come during their first dance. They'd chosen a song that wasn't traditionally romantic, an indie folk tune about finding home in another person. And as they'd swayed together in the center of the dance floor, Gary had whispered in David's ear. Quote 241, Gary had said softly. Quote Tom, David had whispered back. Quote Torso, Gary had said. Quote Dorfamon, quote David had replied, and they'd held each other tighter, both of them overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd found together. The honeymoon had been 2 weeks in Italy, a trip they'd planned together with the same easy collaboration that had marked their entire relationship. They'd split their time between Rome and a small village in Tuscany, exploring ancient ruins and art museums, eating incredible food, and falling even more deeply in love with each other. One evening, as they'd sat on the terrace of their hotel in Tuscany, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the hills golden pink, Gary had grown thoughtful. Do you think we'll remember this moment when we're old? He had asked. Teddy 47. David had said, reaching across the table to take Gary's hand. The big moments and the small ones. The way you look right now, with the light in your hair and wine on your lips. The way it feels to be here with you, completely happy and completely in love. I hope so, Gary had said, squeezing David's hand. What to 15, quoted to 55, David had pointed out. Quoted to 50, quoted to 50, Gary had asked with a smile. Quoted to 50, David had said. Quoted to 50, Gary had asked, looking mortified. Quote 27, David had confirmed with a laugh. Quote, Gary had gotten up then, walking around the table to pull David into his arms. Quote to 259, he'd said, kissing David softly. More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. They'd made love that night with the windows open, the warm Italian air caressing their skin as they moved together with the practiced rhythm of two people who knew each other's bodies as well as their own souls. Afterward, as they'd lain tangled together in the moonlight, David had felt like the luckiest person alive. Gary had asked, echoing his question from the morning after their engagement. Quote 262. David had replied and Gary had laughed, pulling David closer. Quote 23. Gary had promised. Quote charm, quote Simon, David had asked. Quote stars, Gary had confirmed, sealing it with a kiss. Now, 6 months after their wedding and nearly a year since that first night, when Gary had confessed his feelings, David often found himself marveling at how much their lives had changed. They'd settled into married life with the same easy grace that had marked their relationship from the beginning. Gary had officially moved all his belongings into David's room, though they'd kept his old room as an office and guest space. They'd adopted a cat, a rescue named Austin, who had immediately claimed Gary as her favorite human, much to David's mock indignation. Gary had started a book club at work, inspired by his love of reading and his desire to share that passion with others. David had begun writing again, working on a novel he'd abandoned years ago, encouraged by Gary's unwavering belief in his talent. Their families had fully embraced their relationship, with Gary's parents visiting for holidays and David's mother calling Gary her bonus son. They'd made new friends in the LGBTQ plus community, finding a chosen family of people who understood their journey and celebrated their love. But perhaps the most significant change had been internal. David had never realized how much energy he'd been spending on trying to be someone he wasn't until he'd stopped doing it. Living authentically, loving openly, had freed up space in his heart and mind that he'd filled with creativity and joy and deeper connections with the people he cared about. Gary had undergone an even more dramatic transformation. The confident, charismatic man David had fallen in love with had been real, but he'd also been performing, to some degree, playing a role he thought he was supposed to play. The Gary who emerged from their relationship was still confident and charismatic, but he was also vulnerable and thoughtful and unafraid to show his softer sides. "I keep thinking about that night," Gary had said recently as they'd lain in bed, Austin purring between them. Quote, 269, quote, bottom. David had admitted, quote, quote, on, Gary had pointed out, quote, Otter and David had said, quote, Austin, quote, on, Gary had said thoughtfully, quote, Washington, quote, 7, David had suggested, quote, Bayton, quote, Amen, Gary had said, kissing David's forehead. Lovers on love is evolution. Love is a love as revolution, David had countered. Love is as the thing that changes everything. Both, Gary had decided. Love is valid as evolution and revolution, transformation and homecoming, all at once. David had smiled at that, thinking about how perfectly it captured their journey. Loving Gary had revolutionized his understanding of himself while also feeling like the most natural thing in the world. It had transformed him while also revealing who he'd always been underneath. As they drifted off to sleep that night, David had felt the same sense of wonder and gratitude that had sustained him through every day of their relationship. He'd found his person, his home, his future in the most unexpected way possible. What had started as a simple roommate arrangement had become the greatest love story of his life. And the best part was that it was still just the beginning. They had decades ahead of them, years of growing and changing and discovering new depths to their love. They had adventures to take and challenges to face and quiet moments to savor. They had a lifetime of mornings to wake up in each other's arms and evenings to fall asleep tangled together. The electricity between them was still there, that spark that had ignited the night Gary first confessed his feelings. But now it was tempered with comfort and deepened by knowledge, the kind of love that could weather any storm, because it was built on a foundation of genuine understanding and acceptance. David had learned that the best relationships weren't about finding someone who completed you, but about finding someone who inspired you to become more completely yourself. Gary had done that for him, and David liked to think he'd done the same for Gary. Together, they'd created something beautiful and lasting, a love story that proved that sometimes the most unexpected connections were the most profound ones. As David drifted off to sleep in his husband's arms, he thought about that scared, confused man who had answered a roommate ad almost a year ago, and he felt nothing but gratitude for the courage it had taken Gary to knock on his door. That one decision had changed both their lives forever, setting them on a path toward a love neither of them had known they were looking for. Sometimes the best things in life came disguised as ordinary moments, as simple requests for companionship that blossomed into something extraordinary. David and Gary's love story had started with a roommate ad in a shared apartment, but it had become something timeless and true, a testament to the power of authenticity and the magic that happened when two people were brave enough to be completely honest about who they really were, and they lived happily, authentically, and completely in love ever after.